Hi, I want to talk today about one of the key moves in the theory of knowledge. A basic question is not simply what is knowledge and is knowledge even possible, the basic questions we've been considering so far, but about the sources of knowledge. Suppose knowledge is possible. Where does it come from? How do we derive it? There are different answers, of course. Much knowledge I gain from, well, the outside world, experience of the outside world. I perceive things. So I recognize, for example, that there are keys on the table. And in doing that, I do, well, in this case, I have a visual perception, but I also touch them, I can hear them. Through a variety of senses, quite frequently, a complex of senses, we get information about the outside world. The empiricist says that's the only way we get information about the world. We perceive things. We gain experience of the world through the senses. The rationalist says there's something more than that. Yes, much of our knowledge comes from the outside world, but there are additional things, additional sources. So not all of our beliefs are coming from experience, says the rationalist, and some of those beliefs are quite reasonable. Some even count as knowledge, but we can derive them from another source. What kind of other source could there be besides perception of the world? Answer is looking inside our own heads. Through meditation, through reflection, through contemplating the structure of our own minds. So let's take a look at rationalism as it's classically developed in the Enlightenment period, and we're going to look especially today at the views of Leibniz. Leibniz, co-inventor of the calculus and diplomat by profession, was also a great philosopher. His philosophy is sometimes hard to untangle because he didn't write one or a few great philosophical works. Instead, he wrote a variety of shorter works. And so one has to gather those up and compile them and try to understand the overall view. But it's very clear that Leibniz is a rationalist. In fact, one of his extended works is the Nouveau Essai. That is to say, the new essays concerning human understanding, which were a critique of Locke's essay concerning human understanding. Locke is one of the great defenders of empiricism. Leibniz critiques that view and argues in favor of rationalism instead. Well, what is the difference between these two views? Empiricism is simply the view that all of our knowledge of the world comes from experience. It all has its basis in perception. That's not to say we're limited to immediate perception of things like there are keys and the keys make this noise and so on. But we can reflect on that, we can infer things from that, we can gain from other people's experience by listening to their testimony, their reports. We can read books about the experiences of others. And in that way, our knowledge of the world is coming from, in part, our own experience, but in part, the collective experience of humanity. The rationalist says, well, that's all fine. That's a major source of knowledge. It's not the only source of knowledge. Some knowledge is actually inborn. It is innate in their phraseology. It's something that is, if you will, hardwired into us. There are certain things about the world that we are simply built to understand from the very beginning. The contrast between rationalism and empiricism is not merely a philosophical debate, though it is largely that. Psychologists also sometimes adopt rationalist, sometimes empiricist approaches, and study the question of whether babies, for example, have innate knowledge of things like causation or other concepts that they are born with, or whether these are things that they gain through experience. And so it's still an active area of psychological research, and there is no consensus about this issue. It's still very much a live debate. We can distinguish two kinds of rationalism and two kinds of empiricism. There's a fundamental difference between concepts or ideas, as Descartes, Locke, Leibniz, and others of this period refer to it as, or knowledge of judgments. So I have concepts, for example, of triangles, of redness, of friendship, but I also make judgments about those things. I might judge that that dot is red, for example, or that those two people are friends. And there's a basic difference between having the concept or the idea and then using that as part of a judgment, saying something about the world. Well, rationalists and empiricists can disagree about both, and typically do disagree about both, not just one or the other. So there are concept forms and judgment forms of both rationalism and empiricism. What does the concept form look like with respect to empiricism? It's the view that all of our concepts come from experience. All my ideas come through perception, my own perception or other people's perception. All of these ideas are coming from the collective perceptions, the collective experience of humanity. Judgment empiricism is the view that all of our knowledge of the world comes from experience. So it's not just a question of getting all of our ideas from experience, we are also gaining all of our knowledge of the world from experience. No concepts and no judgments are sort of built into us, hardwired into us, and given at birth. They are all things we acquire through experience of the world. The rationalist believes just the opposite of those things. Concept rationalism is the view that some concepts don't come from experience. They're innate. They really are hardwired into us. Judgment rationalism is the view that some of our knowledge of the world is not coming from experience. It's a priori, to use the philosophical term of art. It is independent of experience. A priori is simply Latin for prior to. It is, or from something prior, really. A priori is a term used by medieval philosophers like Aquinas to indicate things that could be done even prior to experience, independently of experience, without having experienced anything yet. A posteriori is the opposite of that. It means from something afterward, from something that, in this case, is experience. So the rationalist view is this. Concept version, there are innate ideas or concepts. We come built in with certain kinds of ideas already in the mind. And the judgment version, there is a priori knowledge of the world. We know some things about the world that are independent of experience. We know them simply because of the structure of our own minds. We're born with that knowledge.